Welcome, everyone, to another wonderful, unusual style podcast. Yes, as always, I do not have a clueless. You know what? They should call me Clueless Eli because I don't have a clue what these people are all about. You know, one day I'm going to get unstuck, aren't I? And we're going to be in trouble. But today we are joined by Michelle Reittinger. Is that correct?
Yes.
Oh my God, I'm getting better by the hour. Can you believe that? Michelle, it's wonderful to meet you. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it's our pleasure, for sure. Now, as always, how we're going to start is just tell us how you help people with your successful business, and from there, we'll go with the flow.
Absolutely. I need to start a little bit with my story because that's where my business grew from. When I was 1 month before graduating from university in 1998, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And when I remember at the time I had mixed feelings about that. I, on the one hand, was relieved that there was an explanation for the previous 2 years of, really depressive states and then elevated states and all of my my mind racing and staying up all night, multiple nights in a row, and, all of the inconsistency in my life. So there was some relief to be afforded an explanation for that. But on the other hand, I remember feeling like I was being told that I was broken. But my doctor assured me that I was being diagnosed with a chemical imbalance and that all we needed to do was find the right medications and I would be okay. And so for the next decade, I actively went to all of my doctor's appointments and took every medication I was given. At one point, I was on 7 different medications, and I did not get better. In fact, I continued to get progressively worse, and it culminated in 2008, 10 years after my initial diagnosis, with a massive breakdown. I ended up hospitalized in 3 different hospitals in 2 different states. They did electroconvulsive therapy on me, and I made multiple attempts on my life. And I was at a point at that time. I was married. I had 3 young children, and I felt like everybody would be better off without me. I wanted my suffering to end. I wanted their suffering to end. And I believed that the only way for that to happen was for me to end my life. But gratefully, I had kind of a miraculous experience watching my children play one day after my 3rd hospitalization. And I had this really clear recognition that if I ever successfully ended my life, that it would ruin my daughter's life, my little 4-year-old daughter. She'd believe it was her fault and it would ruin her life.
Yeah.
And so from that point forward, I committed myself fully to staying alive. I didn't think my life would ever have value and I was just going to suffer, but I knew my daughter's life had value and I didn't want to hurt her. And because I had changed my mindset about it, and at first it was just surviving, but then I started thinking like, nobody's coming to save me. I have to figure out how to help myself because I don't want to just suffer all the time. And I gradually was able to find resources and tools that led me eventually to healing. It took about 14 years. But little bit by little bit, I was able to discover tools and resources that helped me fully recover. I do not experience mood swings anymore. And when I first started recognizing that I was doing so well, I wanted to share what I learned with others because I thought, why did I have to figure this stuff out for myself? It shouldn't have taken me doing all the work and over a decade of effort to figure these things out. And so I wanted to shorten the learning curve for other people. I wanted to help other people find what I had found. And so that's why I started my blog in December of 2020 and eventually started a podcast. And then I wrote a book. I have a book coming out in October. And I didn't understand while I was going through that healing process that I was actually healing. I thought I was just learning how to manage my symptoms better, manage my disorder better. And what I eventually discovered that it is actually possible to heal and recover if you identify the underlying sources of your symptoms. And one of the things that drew me to your podcast was your talk about, trauma. Trauma is very frequently the source of a lot of emotional dysregulation. And the challenge that we have when people are diagnosed with bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety, we think we're being given an explanation. We think we're being given an explanation for something that's wrong with us. And in fact, all we're being told is they're lumping symptoms together and giving it a name,
Yes.
but there's no explanation for what's actually causing the symptoms. And so that's what I do, is I teach people how to have curiosity about their symptoms. What is actually underlying those symptoms? What is causing those symptoms to occur? And then providing guidance about which tools and resources are going to be effective in helping them to resolve those symptoms. And that's what I do for people. That's what I was able to find for myself, and that's what I share with others.
That's amazing, because it's a situation where there's a lot of people out there, and it's not just bipolar, but it's many things that could be wrong with you. And we live in a society where you just pop a pill, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's far more important to find out the core of the problem.
Yeah.
Find out exactly what went wrong and where it went wrong. And once you do that, and I'm not saying you shouldn't take a pill, I'm not saying you shouldn't take a medication, but I think it's far more prevalent, far more important to know exactly where things sidestepped, where things went wrong. And saying that, you may not even be broken, you're just different.
Yeah.
And being different is not wrong, because in society, if you don't fit in a certain box, there's something wrong with you. If you don't fit in that box, there's something wrong with you. So we've got to be very careful in how we perceive ourselves, because we're not necessarily broken. We're just different. It's just one of those things. But what I want to do, I want to go back to when you said things had to change for you when your daughter was 4 years old. You said, no, this cannot go on because my child cannot live through this. It's not fair on her. But for that situation to take effect, why did it have to take until 4 years old? What happened at the time when actually something broke the camel's back?
I think for the most part, so one of the challenges, I believe, that when we are given diagnoses like bipolar disorder or anxiety disorder or depression, is it makes us feel like a victim, because we feel like we have no control. We don't have any ability to affect that.
That's right.
If the pill is not working, then there's nothing that can be done. And in fact, a lot of my treatment bore that out. I found myself resisting a lot of the treatment that I was being offered because it tended to foster self-centeredness in me. This idea that, it's not your fault. Your husband will just have to understand, or your children will be okay, and things like that. And I thought, well, maybe it's not my fault, but it's definitely not their fault. And I don't like that explanation. That didn't feel right to me. And because I felt like a victim, because I felt like I had no control for so many years, I kept thinking the next pill was going to fix the problem. I was told that having bipolar was like having diabetes, and medication was like insulin. And that I clung to that explanation. And I kept trying to find my insulin. What was going to fix the problem? What was going to solve the issue? And the problem that created for me is this feeling of helplessness. Like I had no ability to impact the way that my brain was functioning. I had no ability to stop what was going on. One of the most distressing symptoms that I experienced was a lot of people call it bipolar rage. And it became especially challenging for me and prevalent in my life when I had small children. So after I became a mother, and I had those additional stressors, the hormone changes of going through childbirth, and then the stressors of having young children, and they had a dysregulated mother, so they were emotionally dysregulated. There were a lot of different factors that led into this. And I would have these rage outbursts where I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. I was watching myself do this, and I didn't feel like I had any control. And I had a therapist that would say, count to 10 or take a time out. I'm like, you don't understand. There's not space for me to do that. It's not like I'm getting angry and I could feel myself getting angry. I can stop it. It was like a hair trigger. And it was like the moment the trigger occurred, I was in this outraged, out of body. I had no self-control. And I felt like a victim. I felt like I had no control over what was happening, and everybody around me was suffering. But when I had that experience, I'm a religious person. I believe that it was divine intervention. I believe that there was a whispering from, if people don't believe in that, maybe it was a conscience thing. But for whatever reason, that day, I was feeling sorry for myself. I had just gotten back, recently from my third hospitalization. I was really struggling to understand, like it was sunny outside, but I couldn't feel happy with the sun. Like I just couldn't feel anything. And I was kind of feeling sorry for myself. And I could hear my children playing in the other room. And I went in to look at my children, and all of a sudden in my mind came this thought: if you ever successfully end your life, you will ruin her life. And for about, I don't know, 6 months to a year up to that point, I had been having nightmares about dying. I'd been having daydreams about dying. My mind had convinced me that my children would be better off if they had a different mother. And I really believed the lies my mind was telling me. And in that moment, I knew that they were lies. I knew that it wasn't true. And so I even though I didn't believe that my life had any value at that point, I knew my daughter's did. And so I thought, I don't want to ruin her life. I want to be the best mother I can be. And if the best mother I can be is just surviving so that she has a chance at a decent life, I'm willing to do that. And, and so that was, it was, I don't know why that moment happened in that moment. I don't know why it didn't happen earlier or later, but I will forever be grateful for that, because it changed the way that I looked at what I was doing. And I still felt like a victim, but I had something to fight for at that point. Like I thought, my daughter needs me to survive, and so I will do it for her.
Oh, wonderful. That's beautiful. And I'm glad that happened and you got to that point and you made a change in your life. All right. Okay. What I would like to go back to is, first of all, a lot of the listeners, not everybody's going to know what bipolar is. And it's something we should have discussed earlier on in the podcast, and something's happened. Okay, yes, listeners, I know I should have asked a long time ago. Because there is some of you that doesn't know what bipolar is. Could you give it in layman terms what bipolar is, and then we'll start with your story again?
So interestingly, and I think this needs to be said, a bipolar diagnosis is all it is clustering symptoms. All it is identifying you have this symptom cluster. It is not identifying an underlying medical condition. It's just saying you've got, somebody who's diagnosed with bipolar, there are 3 different types of bipolar. There is bipolar 1, which is what most people who are familiar with the term bipolar will think of, because that is the person who has extreme lows, extreme highs. They're doing, like Kanye West is diagnosed with bipolar 1, where he's talking like a crazy person. And I'm not saying that to say he's crazy, but that's what it sounds like to somebody from the outside. You're like, that's not a rational thought. Like, what are you saying? And people who are diagnosed with bipolar 1 will have what we call psychotic episodes. I started with a bipolar 2 diagnosis, and bipolar 2 is usually somebody who has pretty severe depressive episodes and then might experience something called hypomania, which is not a full manic episode where you're up for weeks spending, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, having psychotic episodes. You might be an elevated mood, and you're talking really fast, and you've got a lot of ideas, and you're gonna, you start a business, and you're gonna, and that was what I started with. And then when I went through my hospitalizations, I had my first documented psychotic episode, and my diagnosis was changed to bipolar 1. And then there's also one called cyclothymia, which is a more mild form of these things, where you have, kind of more mild depression, more mild hypomanic. And so it's just kind of a spectrum. But the challenge that we have, again, like I said, with these diagnoses is the diagnoses, all of the psychiatric diagnoses found in the DSM-5 are actually not describing discrete medical conditions. They're just describing symptom clusters. And the problem that we have in our society is that we have been led to believe, usually by drug companies, that we're being diagnosed with a medical condition, because they are often, comparing it to having diabetes. And diabetes is a medical condition. And so we're thinking, oh, I have a medical condition. And that's not the case. All they're doing is, it would be similar to somebody who started running persistent fevers. And they just kept getting worse. And you got to a point where, like, this is dangerous. I need to go to the hospital. So you go to the hospital. And instead of having any curiosity about what caused the fevers, they're saying, oh, you've got fever disorder. We're going to put you on anti-inflammatories for the rest of your life. And so bipolar diagnosis is just identifying symptoms. You're having these symptoms, and and the treatment generally is psychiatric medication, which did not work for me. it made things so much worse.
So really, it's about categorizing you, basically, just to make things easier, so you can be given the medication. Or I get you, and I feel you, and it's a difficult time for people that want to find out what's wrong with them, and sometimes it's not helpful in that way. All right, okay, so I want to find out how you got to the stage of being diagnosed bipolar. Because obviously you went through some hard times, and it was very, very difficult for you to be able to get to the state of depression, etc. Now you've got hindsight. Now you have hindsight. Yeah. Go back to the beginnings and where it all started in a small way.
Yeah. So as I wrote my book, I was able to be very reflective. I had done a lot of therapy at that point and done a lot of healing from trauma. And as I learned about the different sources of the symptoms that lead you to be diagnosed with bipolar, I was able to look back at my life and say, well, duh. So when I was a young teen, junior high age, and even in my elementary school years, I had some really severe bullying that I experienced. Okay. From 4th grade all the way through 8th grade, every year I would, we moved frequently. And each year I would make a new set of friends. And within a month or so, they would find a very mean, very public way to tell me they didn't want to be my friend anymore. And I would spend the rest of the year with no friends. And by the time I was 7th grade, I was feeling suicidal. Like, I just didn't want to live anymore. I felt like there must be something wrong with me. And interestingly, I had a very stable family life. But I was so isolated at school and I felt so bad about myself that I just didn't want to live anymore. I felt like there must be something wrong with me because nobody wants to be my friend and everybody hates me. And so that was kind of a beginning of, I had some trauma as a child. And some people like to say big T trauma, little T trauma. It was traumatic. It was traumatic to be bullied. It was traumatic to be teased and isolated for 4 years of my childhood.
Can I just stop you there? Just
absolutely.
One thing I want to ask you. So there's a pattern here. The pattern is that you've gone to different schools and you had to go through the whole bullying cycle once again, over and over again. And they did it in a cruel way, which is, what you actually lived through. There's obviously a pattern here. Did you, with hindsight now, see why they were picking on you? Was there because you had better clothes than them, or because you were taller than them? There must have been some kind of thread going through.
I was a very tall, skinny kid that wore hand-me-down clothes that didn't fit me properly because I'm the oldest child in my family. My mom didn't work. My dad worked for the state government, so he didn't make very good money. And, and I felt like, I actually got a paper route when I was, 10, 11 years old to try and earn money so I could buy nice clothes. Because I thought if I can get nice clothes, then maybe people will like me. But I think that very frequently in social settings, especially among children, if somebody seems different, they become a target.
Yes.
And I was an awkward, skinny kid. I was very kind of loud and outspoken, even as a child. And I remember being frequently told to be quiet, be quiet. You're being too boisterous. You're being too loud. So I just think that I felt like the odd man out, and I was frequently ostracized, by other children. Thankfully, when I got into, and there's a whole lot more to the story. I talk about it in my book. I kind of found a little band of misfit kids. We called ourselves the Misfit Toys, and we, that kind of saved me in 8th grade. When I found these kind of outcasts, we were all little outcasts, and we just kind of banded together and survived the last part of junior high together.
Because you were all different.
Yeah. Yep. We all kind of.
Yeah, and you all fit because that was the underlining thread. You were all very different. So.
And I had a tendency to become a chameleon after that. With those friends, I found myself doing what they liked. I got to a point where I just thought, insisting on being myself isn't working. So I need to be whatever somebody else wants me to be. And I remember bragging about that when I was in high school, saying I'm a chameleon. I can fit into whatever group I'm with, and at the time it was actually quite insightful, but not very self-aware as far as that's not healthy. It was,
but understandable.
And it's a very common thing. It's a very common thing for people to do that. I found myself doing that in relationships. I remember when I got into college. So when I was 19 years old, I met a man who just seemed like the catch of all catches. I don't know what age you are, but I don't know if you remember Dolph Lundgren from Rocky IV.
Yeah.
He looked like him. Like, people all the time said he like, you look just like Dolph Lundgren from Rocky IV. He's a very handsome man, very charismatic, and he wanted to date me, and I ended up marrying him, and he became abusive very shortly after our marriage. And because of all of this conditioning in my youth that I needed to change to be pleasing, I kept trying to change myself to please this man who was abusive to me. And all of my relationships later were the same. Like, I kept trying to make myself acceptable. And that causes severe emotional dysregulation, because I was, I believed the abuse was my fault. There are all of these things that led to it. And so interesting. So when I got out of my first marriage, I finally got the courage to leave. I didn't want to be a divorcee. I didn't want that to be my identity. So I refused to go to therapy. I refused to go to, groups or, any kind of group counseling or anything like that. I just wanted to move on with my life. But you can't move on with your life from that kind of trauma without having effects from that trauma. And so when I got into, I was already in college at the point when I married him. I was, had just finished my sophomore year when I finally left. And I moved and went to a new university thinking that will help me. But I could not escape the depression that was, I started experiencing pretty severe depressive episodes. I remember one time, I was on campus. I was supposed to be studying for a test, and I was wandering around in the dark on campus sobbing. I just sobbing uncontrollably. And I would go through periods where I would have severe depression. I would have a hard time going to class. I'd be watching lots of television. And then I would start to get like elevated mood. I would get really excited and, have a new life plan for myself and tell everybody about it. And I couldn't stop talking when I got into that state. Like, I just was like telling everybody, because I was sure this was the inspiration. This was the new plan. This was going to be the thing. And I had one semester where I changed my major 6 times because I was going through this. I'd go through these depressive periods, and then I would get really elevated, and my mind would have a new plan for me. And it was like, I was going to be a math teacher. And then the next time I was going to go to Russia and become a diplomat. And then I was going to be an English teacher. And then I was going to China, so my parents, who lived in a different state, would hear from me daily when I was in that state. I would just be, talking nonstop and really excited. And at first they were like, oh, she's finally turned a corner. And then they wouldn't hear from me for a couple of weeks. And then the next time they would hear from me, I had a whole new plan. And they got to a point where they're like, something is wrong. We don't know what's going on, but something is really wrong. And they talked to some relatives, an aunt and uncle that lived nearby. And they said, yeah, we're seeing some concerning behavior. And so that was what led me to go to the psychiatrist. And when I went to the psychiatrist, I filled out all these forms that talked about family history and that, but none of it asked about trauma. None of it, there was no curiosity into what the sources of the symptoms might be. It was simply about symptoms. All they did was ask me about symptoms. And so my initial diagnosis, because I was severely depressed when I went into the psychiatrist, my aunt went with me, she took me, and she ended up providing a lot of the information. But the psychiatrist was observing somebody in a severely depressed state. And when my aunt was talking about what she observed in my behavior, it sounded like I was anxious. And so I was initially diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorders, and they put me on an antidepressant, and it ramped me up. And then that diagnosis was changed to bipolar 2. So that's how I was initially diagnosed. And looking back, I am like, I had severe trauma that had never been addressed. I didn't know how to use therapy. I actually hated therapy for the first 15 years after my diagnosis, because I would go and I would just talk and talk and talk, and I didn't feel like it was doing any good, and it just made me feel worse. And so I got to a point where I just hated therapy. But once I finally started understanding where all this was coming from, I had micronutrient insufficiency. That's a very common source of symptoms. Most people are not getting the proper nutrition for their brain to function in a healthy way. It's a very common issue. And then I had really severe trauma that had not been addressed. It had been suppressed and buried, but all the emotional turmoil that was caused by that was coming out, and I was developing unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with the trauma. and nobody had any curiosity. And that's the biggest issue I have with these diagnoses, is it stops the curiosity. We think we've been given an explanation, so we stop being curious about what caused the symptoms. You know, and if we go back to that example of somebody who is diagnosed with, you know, fever disorder, we know that would be ridiculous. We know that a fever is an indication the body is in distress, and we need to have curiosity. Let's uncover what's causing the fever. We need to do the same thing with these symptoms. Instead of lumping them into, you know, clustering them together and calling it bipolar disorder or calling it depressive disorder, you know, major depressive disorder or anxiety disorder, we need to say, why is your body anxious? Or what is causing these mood, you know, this huge mood dysregulation that is leading to these, you know, major depressive episodes and then the hypomania? We need to have curiosity and be detectives in our own lives about what is the source of the symptoms, rather than slapping a label on it and calling it good.
Well, what I want to ask about is your coping mechanisms. I'm curious, what was your coping mechanisms? Give me 3 of them.
My biggest one was television. And when I talk about television, I mean like excessive television. I during the years, you know, the past 20 years, one of my biggest triggers for, you know, major mood swings was moving. And we've moved a bunch of times. And whenever I would move, I would get hypomanic during the move. Like my mind would race. I wouldn't get very much sleep. I would be like super focused on all the things that needed to be done. And then after the move was over, I would crash really bad. And I would binge watch like 20 seasons of a show with 20 episodes in every season.
Oh,
you know,
no.
and I'm
bipolar.
back to back. Well, back to back.
I'm always doing that.
So, but do you do it so you're not getting any sleep and you're not eating? Like,
this
was like the moment I got up in the morning all day long until late into the night, not getting enough sleep. You know, I just was, it sounds ridiculous to other people.
No, it's not ridiculous.
But that was one of my coping mechanisms. Some people's coping mechanisms are like drugs and alcohol is a very common coping mechanism, or overeating is a very common coping mechanism. It's for whatever reason, television was the way that my brain tried to escape what I was experiencing, right? Makeup, I know this sounds weird, maybe, but when I was depressed, I would go buy all new makeup. Every time. At one point, I had an Apple box, like a big Apple box filled with unused makeup. I would buy it when I was depressed. I would use it a few times and then it would go in the box. Like I felt horrible. I felt ugly. I felt yucky. And I was trying to make myself feel better. I used to change my hair all the time because I was trying to make myself feel better. And so these were coping mechanisms, and I felt very judgmental of myself for them. And that's one of the things that I think is really, again, sad about the lack of curiosity about the symptoms, is because as we develop coping mechanisms, then we shame ourselves for the coping mechanisms, and we try to fix those surface issues. So I went to like 12-step programs trying to overcome my television addiction. I was trying to fix the problem. I remember at one point I bought a lock that went on my power cord to prevent myself from being able to turn the TV on. Like I was trying to stop the behavior without understanding what the behavior represented.
Yes.
And so that's one of the things that I think is so difficult. Like for example, if somebody has an issue with overeating, if that is their coping mechanism, and overeating is very commonly associated with like trauma, unresolved trauma. Mm-hmm. If you keep trying to fix the overeating, putting yourself on diets and going into the gym and things like that, it is never going to be successful in helping you overcome this if you don't get to the source of what that coping mechanism is trying to do, right?
Yeah.
And so we need to have curiosity. And one of the things that's really interesting in the psychiatric field with these diagnoses is that they will call each of these things discrete names. So meaning like you've got a bipolar diagnosis, and then you have a comorbidity of obesity, and you have a comorbidity of diabetes. Like they call it, they act like each of these are discrete illnesses that are unrelated to each other. Mm-hmm. When in fact, they're probably all sourced at the same place. Exactly. They're probably all found, bound up in the original source of the trauma, or, whatever the issue was.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just layering on top of each other. They're all sourced at the same place. And so we're taking medication for diabetes, and we're taking medication for bipolar, and we're going on diets, and we're seeing, and instead of having curiosity and saying, okay, this is the brain and body asking for help. It is trying to survive. It is asking for help. I need to stop trying to deal with it on the surface level and get down to the source of the problem.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I had a serious back problem, 2 lower discs, and I had to take medication to release them to actually not be so stiff. But once that was over and done with, I refused to get the pain sorted out, because it was very important for me to know exactly what I was doing wrong when I was being rehabilitated. Yeah. I'm a great believer the pain is there for a reason. It tells you what you can and cannot do. It tells you where the source of that pain is. If you spend most of your time taking painkillers and everything else under the sun, what you're eventually doing is you're cutting the pain, which is still there, and you're actually pushing the body in a way that it cannot do. So you create one problem after another, because the other part of the body has to take over the one you're doing damage to. And now we got problem with body part number 2, and so on and so forth. So it seems like the medical institute, they're too fast at giving you the medication, rather finding out why you're doing what you're doing. Why are you putting so much weight on? Maybe it's the amount of sugar you're eating in your diet. Maybe. Now, I'm not listeners saying that you shouldn't take medication, but thinking from the core, asking the why is the most important thing. Once you know the why, then you can do something about it. And it comes down to you being strong enough to actually go on that diet, or strong enough to actually go through that exercise, which you always hated to do. But always start with the why. And it's not just your health, but it's other things in your life. Always ask with the why. Michelle, I'd like to go back to when you was in your teens. All this has started because it was a situation that you was different. There was nothing wrong with you. It is good to be different. Imagine if we all looked the same, spoke the same, jumped the same, the cartwheels the same. What a boring place it would be. So the problem is that you were not broken, or there's nothing wrong with you. It's just that you wasn't accepted in the circles that you were traveling in. Then you found such a great set of friends where you were all different, right? But unfortunately, where it went wrong is that you obviously wanted to change for other people. And that's where the essence goes. Because when it's an issue, when you don't accept yourself, it's always somebody else's fault. So you're always going to change for somebody else. And obviously, when you got into your marriage, again, you just wanted to be whatever they wanted you to be, which means that you are always blaming yourself, because remember, it's somebody else's fault, right? You've got to be for somebody else. And it's obviously escalated from there. And I always say to the listeners when we go through the podcast, and it's easier said than done, I'm not judging anybody, you have to accept who you are. And if you don't like who you are, then make the change, and if the people don't like who you are, then they're the wrong people in your life. And again, I'm not judging. I'm saying things in black and white, and it's not easy. Trust me, it's not. It is a journey. But Michelle's just shown how she's got to the stage of being diagnosed bipolar, because there's these successions of things that have shaped her through her journey. But at the same time, they're not necessarily bad things, because as always, when great leaders are made, they're made through pain, unfortunately. How many great leaders do you know that were just born with the silver spoon and everything went tickety-boo and nothing went wrong in their life? I've never seen one. I've never spoken to one. I've spoken to so many successful leaders. And what I'm saying to you, listeners, as much as you're going through pain and anguish now, be that physical or mental, it doesn't really mean that you're not going to be powerful, a leader, or whatever your goal is. It means you're following the journey, just like Michelle has done. She's created a business because of the pain she went through, because of the experience she went through, and she's put it all together. And she's amazing at what she does because of that so-called painful journey. Some of it was painful, some of it wasn't, but she had to go through it, didn't you, Michelle?
Absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't be who I am today. And I know that this feels trite. I think I hear a lot of people say it, but it's very true that I wouldn't want it to be different. Yes. I wouldn't have said that during it. You know, when I was going through all of that, I would have given anything for it to be taken away.
Yeah.
But looking back, I'm filled with gratitude that, number one, that I'm alive and that I chose to stay, because I have a very beautiful life now. But I would not have the life I have now if I hadn't gone through the things that I went through, you know, and I feel so much purpose in what I do now with my, you know, in helping other people. And I'm able to understand where they're coming from because I've been through it. And so that's one of the things I look back on, even in my childhood, the fact that I was ostracized and bullied and left out and left alone actually made me very aware of other people. And I'm very grateful for that now, because I notice people who are on the fringes. When I'm in social settings or in group settings, I don't always gravitate towards the most, you know, the most outspoken or the most, you know, beautiful or anything. I notice people who are on the fringes. I notice people who are by themselves or look uncomfortable, and I'm able to draw them in and help them to feel more comfortable because I know what it feels like to be that person.
Totally. Totally. And it's important to look at your situation, you know, listeners. You know, life, it may feel that you're being punished. Life is not there to punish you at all. Life is there. I'm a Buddhist, right? Yin and yang, cause and effect. You do one thing, something happens. So it's not a punishment. It's just that if something hits back to you in a negative way, then you've done something that's not correct for you. And I mean what I say, not correct for you. Because another person could do the same thing and their life is beautiful. You've got to find what works for you. And if it's a situation where something's not working for you, you in particular, then obviously you've done the wrong thing. Thank that situation, because remember, to be successful, you have to make mistakes. You cannot be successful overnight. And Michelle has taken this beautiful journey, and she's gone through great pain. Well, I mean, we haven't scratched the surface, to be honest. I could easily speak to her for a few hours. There's far more pain she's gone through than you're just hearing. She's skimming the surface. But she understands, by having gratitude, she's taking power back, and she's in a position to shape her life because she accepts who she is, what she did wrong, and because she can do something about it. But if it's he did that and he did that and he did, then well, she's got nothing to change, right? Why would she change anything? And if she had that mindset, it will carry on, and she would not be in a position to put a beautiful business together to help people in such a positive way by taking the pain and her struggles and trying to alleviate or shorten this pain for everybody else. Am I right, Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things there's two things that I think that came to my mind as you were talking about that I feel like we're really have been critical in this process. Number one is we are not meant to be alone. You know, as human beings, we need connection. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned earlier, if you are struggling with unhealthy connections or being ostracized or not included, look for other connections. You know, there are others out there that will be the right people for you.
Totally.
And it's really important, I think, to identify what do you value? You know, because it's very easy. Like I said, I was really blessed with my little band of misfit friends, because thankfully at that time, it was okay that I liked what they liked, because they were, you know, very good people. They were very sweet people. But as I got older and I got into some really unhealthy relationships, that habit of changing to suit the people around me led to really bad things. I ended up in an abusive marriage. I ended up in abusive relationships. And so I had to learn, like, what are the things that really I want in my life? What do I want in friendship? What do I want in relationships? What kind of people do I want to surround myself with? And the second thing is that it's critical for us to take responsibility for ourselves. Because when I was going through the healing process with my, when I was actually ready to confront the trauma that I experienced in my first marriage and other traumas that I experienced in my life, there were times when I felt it was difficult for me to not get, focused on, well, he did this to me and this, I'm suffering because he did this and that. And doing all of that kept all the power with him.
That's right.
And when I was able to finally say, what am I going to do about it?
Yes.
It's happened. It's in the past. I can't do anything about that now, but what will I do moving forward? And being willing to face the pain, being willing to take responsibility for my pain and responsibility for my healing empowered me to actually heal. And I know empowered is like an overused word, but that's really what it is. It is empowering you to heal and move forward and grow out of the pain. I one of my favorite people in the world is, to listen to, like, I love his speeches, and was Nelson Mandela. And that man suffered in such an unjust way for so many years.
Yeah.
But he chose not to let himself be a victim. He chose not to dwell on the people who had hurt him, not to focus on them and blame them and keep, allow them to hold that power. He chose to take his own power back, to take responsibility for himself, to change what he needed to in order to be able to move forward in his life. And he had an extraordinary impact on it, not just his nation, but the world.
Yes.
And so that's what I think a lot of times, it's so tempting to wallow in victimhood, but it doesn't do us any good.
It's true. It's true. And that's where the power is. It's just acceptance and taking on that you can make the change. If something happens to you and someone does you something, you've got to take that on. And with that, you can make a huge amount of change within your life. So moving on from all of that you've gone through your life, how did it affect everyone else passing through your life? So I take it your parents, you've already spoken about your parents when at a certain point they said, look, you're not right. But let's go before that. They saw certain changes before your husband, and they saw you being a chameleon, because remember, they know you inside out. Did they ever worry about you or speak about that and say, oh, Michelle, what's happening with you? Did they see that change had taken about round about your teenager years? Did it worry them or?
Yeah, off and on. But I think at the time, I was their oldest child and they were married quite young. And so I think they just thought, well, this is just what teenager looks like, And so, my parents were very diligent in talking to me about holding onto my, the values that I know are right and trying to make good choices. Thankfully, when I was in high school, I loved swimming and I became a competitive swimmer. And I did that from, all the way through high school and my first 2 years of college. And that kind of saved me in a lot of ways during that period of time because the exercise, number one, was excellent for my mental health. And it was great for my self-esteem. And that was actually the first time that I was doing something that I liked. Outside in social settings, I still had a tendency to try to become whatever people wanted or, wanted me to around me. But that exercise, that identity as a competitive swimmer, and I became very good. I broke records when I was in college and I earned, All-American status. But my parents, one of the things that they struggled with too was even when I received my diagnosis, they didn't know what that meant. What does that mean? How, they just thought, well, okay, you just take your medication and you'll be okay. And so it was very distressing for them to see me continue to deteriorate over the years, even though I was doing what the doctors were telling me to do.
Yes.
And then of course the relationships that were most impacted were the relationships with my husband and my children. Those were the ones that were most severely impacted. And that has been part of the healing process, has been me helping my children to heal, and in giving space for my husband to heal in his own time, because our relationship really suffered severely, especially the year that I had my breakdown. I was extremely erratic during that year. One day I was, totally in love with my husband. The next day I needed to leave him, and I was sure that the marriage was over. And, and I was the one who actually had to found me and stop me the 3 times that I made attempts on my life. And so it was very traumatic for him. And one of the things that I share with people is how important it is for you to accept personal accountability and responsibility for yourself in your own healing, but allowing other people to heal in their own time as well. I had to give space for my husband to heal, and our relationship really struggled for a number of years because an emotional wall kind of went up between us. His survival mechanism was just, shut things down.
Yeah, of course.
And then with my children, I was, once I started understanding how to utilize therapy to actually heal, I was like, oh, I need to help my kids heal, and so I put my kids in therapy, and both of them resisted at first. They were like, I don't like this. I don't want to do this, and I was wanting to fix them. But I started understanding that's not how that works. I can't fix my kids. I can't force them to heal.
Okay, let's talk about your husband, because it's interesting to talk about everybody that was close to you. Now, you said he had to go through a stage of healing, but before we go through the stage of healing, you've obviously had this conversation that the question I'm going to ask. How did he cope through those episodes where you were one extreme to another? That couldn't have been easy. You've already said it's not. So what has he said to you, how he got through that episode? Because, God, that was so difficult for him.
He kind of buried himself in work. He just focused on, he worked a lot of hours. When we were the first 7 years of our marriage, he was working full time, like 13, 14-hour days, and going to school at nights and on weekends. And, and so he was, a lot of it was just that was kind of an escape for him. It wasn't a conscious decision. He wasn't consciously thinking, I'm going to go to work. Yeah, but that was the only way for him to feel like he had any control over anything in his life was, I'm going to be the best provider I possibly can for my family. I'm going to make sure that there's, money in the bank and food on the table. And so that became a coping mechanism for him. Like we talked about coping mechanisms. A lot of time we always think about coping mechanisms as, there's good coping mechanisms and bad. Anything that you take to excess, where you are avoiding pain and you are avoiding distressing situations, is not good. It's your brain trying to cope. It's your brain trying to take, but it became an issue later because it was a way to avoid facing the problems. But, and I asked him, the thing that was the big question for me is, why didn't you leave me in 2008? Like, I would not have blamed my husband if he'd left. Looking back, it was shocking to me that he didn't leave me. I would have left me. At one point he came, the first hospitalization was in a different state because he was going out of the country, and they didn't feel like it was safe for me to be left alone with the children at home because I was not in a good mental place. And so they flew me out to Utah where my family was. I had, family out here. And when they picked me up at the airport, they realized how severe things actually were and drove me straight to the hospital.
Really?
And he didn't know. He was out of the country on a thing for his education for school. So he had no idea what was going on until he got back into the country. And when he found out, he flew out to Utah because he thought I was just being sent out here and we were going to stay with my sister. And then I'd come home when he got back. When he came to the hospital to visit me, he said it was shocking to him to see me because I did not look like the same person. I had completely changed. My makeup was totally different. My clothing was totally different. Like, I had bought clothes. I had been released from the hospital temporarily, had a psychotic episode, and was put right back in. Mm-hmm. But during that time, I had credit card numbers memorized, and I bought a bunch of clothes for myself. Like, he didn't recognize me emotionally, mentally, physically. Like, I was completely different. He'd never seen me psychotic. He had never seen me in this state before. And they were doing electroconvulsive therapy on me, which was messing with my memory. Mm-hmm. And it was extremely distressing to him. And he didn't know what to do. And it was a short time later was when I made my first attempt on my life. And after the second attempt was when things just shut down. He just emotionally shut down. And it was not a conscious thing. It was a coping mechanism. His body could not handle what was going on. And it just emotionally, he just cut off from me. And so I kept trying to force him to reconnect with me. And it took time for me, as I did my own healing, to recognize I cannot force him to do that. I need to be patient with this process and allow him to heal in his own time. It's similar to, emotional wounds are often very similar to physical wounds in that you cannot make, like you can't make a broken leg heal faster than it's going to, right?
Yeah, that's true.
You cannot force emotional wounds to heal faster than they need to. There's a process that has to be gone through.
Of course.
But I asked him for years, like, why didn't you just leave me? And he I don't know. He couldn't answer the question. And then finally, a couple of years ago, he agreed to be interviewed on my podcast. And I said, I'm going to ask you that question. Can you think about it? And so when I asked him the question, he said, well, I had made a commitment to you when we got married, and I just wanted to keep my commitment. And he didn't want to leave just because things got hard, is what he said. And so, I will forever be grateful that he didn't give up. I'm so grateful for my husband now. I'm so grateful for the life that we have and for our children and our family. And not as many people, I don't fault people for leaving. Like I said, I wouldn't have faulted my husband for leaving. Mm-hmm. It was very distressing what he was going through. And he didn't have any ability to affect the outcome. He didn't have any control over what was going on. It's a really hard thing to be married to somebody who's struggling with those things. He's
actually an amazing man to be able to go through that, as know that more than anybody else. Just to go through the emotional turmoil and the stamina is just amazing. Now, your children, how did they cope? You've had that discussion with how did they feel, actually, from their point of view? How did they feel going through these episodes? How did they really feel?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of times when people go through trauma as children, they don't remember it. And so my son has very few memories from his childhood. And that was one thing that we finally were able to get to the root of and work through with him. But it was really, the way his mind coped with it was just shutting things out. And our daughter, my oldest daughter, who's the one that was a 4-year-old, her response was, to shut off as well. Like there was a wall that went up between us. And when she was in high school, anything that I wanted, she wanted the opposite, and so the way that the number one thing that I have discovered in healing relationships is focusing on healing yourself, because we don't have control over the other person. We don't have the ability to make another person do what you want them to do or anything like that. One of the best descriptions I've heard of this is in Harriet Lerner's Dance of Anger. She talks about when you're in a dance, in a relationship. So we could, using the dance as a analogy, if one partner changes their steps, the other person has to change their steps or choose to leave the dance, right? And so I spent a lot of time trying to fix my husband and trying to fix my children because I felt responsible. I felt a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. And so I wanted to help them heal. I wanted to fix them.
I hear you.
Nobody wants to be fixed. That doesn't feel good, right?
No.
And nobody wants to be told that they need to be fixed, And so I had to learn that the best thing I could do for my husband and for my children is heal myself. And so, that was a really empowering experience for me because I can change myself. I do have the ability to affect my behavior and my thoughts and that. And so I just went to work working on healing myself. And as I did that, trust started to be reestablished in the relationships because my behavior changed. The way that I interacted with them changed. And it took, for my children, especially for my daughter, a lot of the issue that she struggled with was trust because she didn't know which mom she was going to get when she was little. Yeah. She didn't know if it was the fun mom who had all kinds of ideas and we were going to make big princess dresses and have big parties, or the mom who couldn't function and was sleeping on the couch while they watched TV, or the mom who was blowing up in anger. She never knew which version of her mother she was going to get. And so it took years of me proving to her I am changing, I am different, If I did have, a negative interaction with her, I apologize immediately and say, I'm so sorry. Can we do that again? Will you let me try again? I did not handle that well. And so over time, she was able to start to trust that, yes, mom is healing. Yes, mom is sorry. Yes, mom is different. And then she started to feel more confident. And I think I do need to go to therapy. I think I do, and as I shared, I'm very open with my family about what I'm going through in the healing process, because I want them to see there's nothing shameful about therapy. There is nothing shameful about, doing the things necessary to heal emotional wounds and that. And so as I talked to them about those things, they became more confident in the value of the tool and the resource, and willing to seek assistance and help in healing.
And it's not only that, by being transparent, you're actually showing the trust. Mm-hmm. Because if they can see through the looking glass and they can see exactly what is there, then they know what is possible and what isn't possible. So by, again, accepting who you are and taking measure of your power, and doing what you need to do yourself, and just being honest about the fact, then it just helps people just to come towards you that much faster. It takes time, but if you're going to deny the situation, then it's like a thief, right? Yeah. If someone's always stealing in the room and stealing from the family, well, the family's not going to really trust you. But if you're honest, and you're honest with what you do within that room, then why does anybody have to believe that you're going to do the opposite? So it takes time. It's that honesty, and you did that. And I'm sorry I had to ask some of the questions, especially about your husband and children, but I want the listeners to understand that you are very good at skimming over the surface because you want people to see an overview. But I think it's very important to see underneath what really goes on and how you've really struggled, but still come through those hardships. I think that's amazing. And it's not just you. I'm not giving kudos to you. I'm giving kudos to your husband. Yeah. I'm giving kudos to your children, and it takes the village, not only the family, but the village, to actually come through this all. You had your husband, you had your parents, you had your children, and all those other things that make a difference. But by being transparent and being honest with yourself, you give power to other people to let them in, to just accept that, oh, okay, I see the changes, let's support it that much more. And that wasn't easy for you. It wasn't easy for you to be transparent, because remember, you was always the chameleon. Remember, you lived so long being that way. For you to make that transformation, oh my God, that was so difficult, especially under the guise of depression and everything else. So you had to make the change. Not only that you had to accept the change, but you had to do it under, all these things that were pushing you down 24/7. And that, Michelle, is amazing. How wonderful that is. And you see what I'm saying, listeners? You're not unique. We all go through our ups and downs. And it's very important for us to go through these stages, because that's what makes us great leaders and get to our goal. It's as simple as that, even though it's not as simple to actually carry out. So, Michelle, I'm going to put a line in the sand, because I will sit here just delving into, because you've got a beautiful, rich history, and I do call it rich because this is why you are such an amazing person, and you've built an amazing business based on your experience and your real life experience, not education experience, but real life. And hence why I believe you give an amazing, how can I say, opportunities for people to work with you, your team, whoever, because you understand where they're coming from. You understand their pain. And with that, it's very easy for you to a certain extent, because sometimes I'm sure you have to relive it when you're listening to somebody and you're trying to help somebody. But it's easier for you to actually understand where they're coming from, and then you know exactly what needs to be done to shorten their pain compared to what you had to go through. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I am grateful because I can have compassion for what they're going through, but it doesn't trigger anything in me anymore because I've been able to resolve those triggers. I've been able to resolve the trauma and the pain. It's over the past 4 years, as I've 3 years as I've gone through, developing the my program and my blog and my podcast, and that it's been interesting being back in this space that was actually super helpful on my learning or on my healing journey, because there were things that were brought up that I hadn't resolved. One of them was I had a really negative interaction with somebody online one time. Somebody was calling me dangerous and saying what I was saying was dangerous to people. And I had what I recognized as a trauma response to it, and I was thinking, I don't care what this person says. I know that I'm not a liar. I know that what I'm doing is helpful and not dangerous, but I could feel the trauma response in my body. I could feel it happening. And I was able to take all the information to my therapist and say, okay, I don't know why this triggered a trauma response in me. Like, I don't know this person. I don't know why it upset me so much. And we were able to dig down and be detectives and look for the source of the pain, and discovered that it was the unhealed trauma from my hospitalizations. And I was able to process that trauma and resolve the trauma. And so I've gotten to a point where I'm able to hold people's challenges and pain and difficulty with tremendous compassion without harming myself. I've been able, I have very healthy boundaries. I have done all the healing that I need to do to, healing is a journey. So I'm sure that there's still things that I'm learning, but I'm able to be in this space and hold space for others with tremendous compassion without risk of harming myself.
You know what? I can see that. What I want to know is, how do you help people? Now, what I specifically mean, is it a one-to-one you do? Do you do groups? Do you work for corporates? In which way, how does the process work?
Yeah, what I've developed is I call it the Simple 7 protocol. And it's actually currently an online program. So I have a curriculum modules that people go through to learn each of the 7 steps in the healing process. And in that group, we also do weekly Zooms where the whole group gets together and I see how everybody's doing. It's really an awesome experience because everybody gets to learn from each other. So people are in different parts of their healing journey. And so, they are able to hear what somebody's struggling with. And then we talk about it and which tools will best suit them in that stage of their healing process. And then I also do a one-on-one session with each of them each month. It's called a success session, where they're able to talk to me one-on-one and they get assistance in figuring out, what they need at that point. And it's been really amazing. The group that I'm working with right now is fantastic. They're all very, one of the things that I've learned is a lot of times, like I said, you can't force a healing journey, right? And there are times when people come to me and they're not ready to start the healing process. I say, are you in a place where you want to cope and manage? And that's totally fine. If somebody is just wanting to cope and manage, I have a free resource on my website that I offer to people. It's called a Mood Cycle Survival Guide. And it's something that I developed for myself to learn how to be proactive at managing my symptoms. Instead of being a victim to them, it's a 4-step plan that somebody develops that helps them to be more proactive instead of reactive, proactive in managing symptoms and anticipating, the triggers and symptoms. And if somebody is ready to start the healing process, then the program is where they need to go. So it's, everybody's like I said, everybody's at different points in their journey. And I feel like it's important to provide resources for people along the spectrum of that journey.
How wonderful. Do you see her? She's a genius. She really is. And the book. Tell us more about the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. A year ago, that wasn't even on my radar, but I found myself frequently as I was talking to people feeling like there was too much information to communicate in one conversation. And as I wrote the book from the perspective of what do I wish somebody had told me when I was diagnosed with bipolar, 20 plus years ago. And so the book is The Upside of Bipolar: 7 Steps to Heal Your Disorder. And it is written as a self-help book. The first 4 chapters of the book are my story. So I've shared a little bit of it here, but I share my story of how I ended up with a diagnosis what happened after that, what my recovery, and as I started the recovery journey, and then the steps that I took to heal, and each of those steps is supported by research. That was one of the things that was so eye-opening for me as I went through my own healing journey, and as I was discovering each of these resources, was how much research has already been done on each of these tools, that they are proven to be effective at resolving underlying sources of symptoms. And when you put them together in this integrated research-based program, you have a path to healing, a very clear path to healing. And this is the treatment plan I wish I had been given when I was first diagnosed.
Okay. Well, anything else you want to tell us about that we've missed?
I think that if somebody is struggling with where to go, what do I do? If somebody's struggling with symptoms, or maybe they've been newly diagnosed, or they've been, diagnosed and struggling for years and nothing seems to be getting better, the first thing that I would encourage them to do is start listening to my podcast. I've got a, podcast. I have blog articles that I've written, what I wish I'd known, when I was going through cross titration, when I was coming off of medications and getting my brain to heal.
Mm-hmm. What's the podcast called? What's it called?
I'm sorry? The podcast, it's Everything is the Upside of Bipolar. So the Upside of Bipolar is my podcast, it's my book, it's my website. Everything is called the Upside of Bipolar. And then that free resource, the Mood Cycle Survival Guide, it's something that anybody can use. It's interesting. I've had conversations with family members and friends who don't have bipolar, but have found that resource actually extremely beneficial. The 4 steps in that program, number 1 is, who is your team? Who are the people that you can turn to for help when you need help? What does that help look like? And what are the healthy boundaries around it so you don't burn out relationships? The second thing is identifying triggers and symptoms, learning how to become an expert on yourself, recognizing symptoms for what they are. And what are the things that actually trigger those symptoms? That's your detective work, learning how to identify those connections between the triggers and the symptoms. The third step is power priorities. What are the things that need to happen no matter what state you're in, so that you make sure that the things that matter most get done when you're struggling. And then the fourth piece is, how do you get yourself back into a healthy, balanced mental state? How do you create a plan for yourself when you are struggling so that you can get yourself back to mental health and balance? And it's a free resource on my website. Anybody can use it. And I highly recommend, if somebody is struggling with any kind of mental health challenges, that they try implementing that in their lives. It's a great resource for helping to manage and your symptoms and live a better life, live a more proactive life.
Well, I'm glad you said that, actually, because I was going to suggest anybody with mental health can actually use a system like that. Remember what I said before, listeners, it's a situation that it's a categorization, bipolar, but there are parts to bipolar. So as long as you've got you're suffering from certain mental health issues, it can still help you with what she's got for you. So still, I would say, still reach out, have a look at the resources, find out if it's something that can help you. If it can't, then nothing's hurt you. But as always, I will put all the information below, all the connections that you need, so you can get to her very easily. Michelle, how can they easily get to you? I know I'm going to put some details down below, but how can they contact you?
Yeah, the best place to go is theupsideofbipolar.com. That's my website. That's my handle on all the social media platforms, The Upside of Bipolar. And I'd love to hear from people. My email address is michelle@theupsideofbipolar.com.
Oh, you've gone and done it now, Michelle. You put your email address in there. Now people have listened to you.
It's in my book. It'll be out there anyway.
Oh my God! This is a chatter. This is one that likes to talk too much. Definitely, without a doubt. But Michelle, thank you very much for giving us your precious time and your story. It's not been easy speaking about certain things, so we appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And in the meantime, listeners, listen out for the next podcast coming through. You know me, I don't know what they do. We just have a conversation. Who knows? One day I'll stumble and it'll probably hurt, but not today. In the meantime, sayonara.
If you want to see more companies make things in America, consider buying more things from companies who are already doing that very thing. Companies like American Giant. These guys have been making T-shirts, sweatshirts, flannels, and blue jeans in America for the last 14 years, with cotton grown right here in the USA. That means good jobs for lots of hardworking Americans in factory towns all over the country. Check out their stuff in stores everywhere, or pick up something awesome at American-Giant.com.